dig, fight, explore, getting crushed by a boulder. Terraria has so many different things for players to enjoy, and it has brought in one of the biggest and most dedicated fanbases that any game has ever gathered, consistently being one of the highest rated and selling games on Steam, as well as having such a strong presence over here on YouTube as well, especially here in the UK, where seemingly every jolly man in the country has a Terraria channel. My personal favourite aspect of this game though, and the thing that's in my opinion differentiated from most other survival games, is the focus on combat, and particularly the wide spectrum of boss fights you encounter throughout the game. Most other survival games focus their progression around making, well, surviving easier and making the resources needed to do so less of a hassle to obtain. An obvious example of this being making a farm in Minecraft to make getting food and other resources much easier. And while Terraria obviously does this quite a bit, the feeling of progression you get in this game is much more closely tied to defeating larger and more dangerous bosses. And that far more combat focused progression system is one I really enjoy. It reminds me of other boss rush like games like, weirdly enough, the Souls series. So, with this kind of progression, it's key for each and every one of these bosses to feel like an event when you fight them. They need to feel important and impactful, able to leave an impression on the player that makes them feel like they've achieved something. And the first boss of the game arguably has the most responsibility out of any of them, as it's one of the key moments the game has to hook players in and make a good first impression. As, if the first boss fight isn't fun or satisfying to fight, then it makes the rest of the game's bosses far less desirable to work towards, even if their quality is higher. So, in Terraria's case, the Eye of Cthulhu is normally the first major encounter players have, by either finding the suspicious looking eye in a chest underground, seeing the crafting recipe from the guide with these lenses they've been picking up, or if the thing just randomly decides to run up on you randomly for no reason. However the player ends up stumbling on the massive eyeball, this fight has to be a fun introduction to the bulk of this game's combat. So does it leave a strong first impression and succeed at being the first boss fight? Let's find out. Now, one of the most important things to get right to make a satisfying boss fight is to make players feel excited for it before the fight even starts, creating a sense of anticipation that makes the moment you defeat the boss that much more satisfying. There's God knows how many examples of this across the world of gaming, so I won't get into anything too specific. So instead, let's walk through how Terraria slowly builds up the player's excitement for beating their first boss, specifically the Eye, and how it makes for an intriguing experience early into each playthrough. I'm going to be looking at this from the perspective of a new player, as if you've played this game for an unhealthy amount of time such as myself, most of these bosses are going to feel like formalities nearly every time you fight them, so the new player experience is going to illustrate my points way better. So, when a new player who has no knowledge of this game loads into a new world, their first instincts are likely to be similar to any other survival game. Chop down some trees, have a scan of the stuff you can craft, and explore the immediate area around them, and maybe even build themselves a little home if they can find the time. Sure, they might be harassed by some very weak slimes, or whatever, but the daytime of the first day is overall very peaceful and meant to hook the adventurous aspects of this game, teaching the players to be curious about their surroundings and how to look for loot that might give them an advantage, such as finding chests strewn about the surface or in any caves they stumble upon. However, as night falls and things get darker, the monsters start spawning, and while things like zombies aren't going to seem out of place to players, their attention is more likely to be drawn to the demon eyes that start flying in and knocking them about. They can fly, so simply building upwards isn't going to counter them like it does for zombies. They're much faster than any other mob you face up to this point, and they are overall a much bigger threat in this extremely early game than any other nighttime monster you might find, so the player is going to be the most wary of them, creating a solid memory of these eyeballs, especially when they start grouping up and creating hordes that the player has to run madly away from. As the new player slowly progresses through the early game, gathering more ores, better weapons, and armor, eventually they'll reach the point where the Eye of Cthulhu decides it's tired of waiting on you and jumps them in the back alley, either by the player getting too curious about these suspicious looking eyes they've been gathering, or when the Eye decides that your defense is just a bit too high and it just wants to have a scrap. The likely vastly underprepared player is then going to get stomped in the panic of having a massive eyeball run up on them and ram into them at high speeds, especially if they make it to phase 2 and see it grow a massive sharp-teethed mouth. And that experience of suddenly getting attacked by what is, at this early point in the game, the biggest and most threatening creature you've seen up until this point, is going to leave a massive impression on them. It's going to teach them that not only do the bosses in this game need an appropriate level of preparation to beat them, such as building arenas or gathering some potions to help with your mobility and such, but the encounter will also make players want to get some nice revenge on this thing. There's no way that this thing is going to rob them of their hard-earned money twice in a row, and now it's time to make sure of that. So, we have a boss that is a massive version of one of the most distinctive enemies in this pre-boss stage of the game, that can either be spawned in by a curious item that can be found during a spelunking adventure, or it can just appear at random one night to jump you, that needs specific preparation to have a chance of beating for new players. So much goes into making the final fight against this thing feel like a milestone for new players. So, with all this build up covered, how does the fight itself stack up? There's a ton of things we have to talk about with this guy, so it's hard to find a place to start, but considering this is meant to be a channel about art first and foremost, we should probably begin with how effective this thing's animations and overall design work are, as the first boss of the game, so let's dive into that. As we have already established, this thing follows the trope of an early boss just being a supersized and more powerful version of a regular enemy that you meet at the start of the game. Hell, Terraria has another example of this in King Slime, but he's lame, so who cares? Unlike this thing, which is just like any other slime monster we've seen a billion times across gaming, the design of a floating eyeball is at least slightly less common, especially considering the very high amount of detail crammed into this sprite, although that does come at the cost of having simplistic animations to say the least. The veins and tendrils that this thing is covered in look amazing and make this thing look like a truly disgusting monster, and the phase 2 transition, while looking goofy as hell with this spin, is an unexpected shift for an eyeball to make, and is another memorable design choice that makes this thing super distinct. Speaking of those animations though, and I'm torn on whether I love or hate them honestly. On one hand, outside of the slight movement of the tendrils and stuff on the eye's body, the sprite itself doesn't actually have any sort of animation. The sense of movement is entirely carried by the boss's actual moves, and it ends up looking functional, yes, but nowhere near as polished or elaborate as a lot of other bosses in this game. Hell, even some pre-hard mode bosses like Queen Bee. There are a bunch of fair reasons for this. The Eye of Cthulhu was the first boss fight ever designed for the game. It's meant to be the introductory boss for the game as well as a mascot. The attack patterns are meant to ease players into the difficulty curve of the game, even in expert mode where the eye starts getting more aggressive with chaining charges together and such. So you can't expect this guy to have Moonlord scale or animation quality, but the animations themselves are very simple, which might be a negative for some, or a charming showing of the game's unique style for others. That's everything there is to say about this thing visually, considering its simplicity. So before we get into the fight itself, we have a few more small parts to talk about, such as the sound design for this thing. And by that, I mean the one other sound effect that anyone cares about, being that iconic boss roar. This sound has become one of the more recognisable parts of this game, as the sound you hear when shit is about to hit the fan. And while it is quite a generic roaring sound, it helps with making the Eye of Cthulhu seem that much stranger, as do you see anything on this thing that could roar? Nope. So it makes players more suspicious about this thing's true form until the second phase hits, where the sound effects makes way more sense and makes this thing look more beastly. Now we can get into my favourite part of these kinds of videos, that's being staring at the trivia section of whatever relevant wiki I can find, and waffling on about some of the stuff that makes me smile. So let's get into some of those fun facts. Going back to the artwork for a second, the Eye of Cthulhu can actually be seen floating around in the background rarely, which adds to the lurking sensation that seems to be a bit of a theme with this boss. It matches with the iconic "you feel an evil presence watching you" quote that appears right before the boss spawns in on its own. It makes the hype and build up for the fight even greater as it makes your enemy feel more tangible. As one final thing before we finally get into the fight itself, some of the items associated with the eye have become fan favourites in the community. The biggest example of this being the expert mode exclusive Shield of Cthulhu, giving the player the ability to dash nearly out of the gate, which is a ridiculously powerful ability to have this early, when in normal difficulties you would only be able to reasonably get this ability post Plantera with the Master Ninja gear. It makes the achievement of defeating the Eye way more satisfying and rewarding on expert mode, adding some external value to the boss outside of just wanting progression or a piece of a checklist completed. But that's enough waffling on about random trivia and avoiding the most important part of this thing, so let's get to the actual damn boss fights and how fun it is for a major first encounter for this game. So, you've got your arena of a few long rows of platforms set up, your buff potions are fully ready in your inventory, and you have your trusty weapon beside you. Probably some magic or ranged weapon so you can keep your distance from this thing. The early stages of the fight consist of the Eye hovering closely above you, while spawning little Eye minions and occasionally charging at you with a bit of speed but nothing too panic-inducing. It's almost like the Eye is, fittingly, observing your movements and learning how to fight you before really committing to try and kill you. Very similar to the player learning the boss's movements patterns during the fight. It creates this interesting yet intense dynamic between you and the boss. But then, once you shoot this thing down to about half health or so, the spinning animation begins and the Eye is done holding back, revealing the gaping maw it was hiding and becoming far more aggressive, giving up on hanging back and summoning minions to chip you down slowly, instead making the charges far more frequent and dangerous, increasing both the speed at which it moves and the range from which it can hit you at, scaring the player into having to stay far further away than in the first phase, limiting their DPS, which is really spooky for first time players, considering that this fight is technically on a time limit as well, as the boss will just sod off when it hits daytime. The expert mode and above version of this fight makes it even more intense by introducing the Eye's most dangerous attack, where it starts dashing at you back to back so quickly that the sprite becomes blurry, uttering a brand new, more desperate roar while barreling at you at speeds you haven't seen up to this point in the game, creating by far the most threatening moments you face at this point, and making the tension of this fight even greater, even for more experienced players, as one wrong move and suddenly you're in the splendour of this thing's mouth. After an intense back and forth during the second phase, running away when the charge rush comes at you and fighting back in the small downtime between them as the Eye recharges, the player finally brings its health down to 0 and the loot drops, ending the first major boss fight of the game, and giving the player the biggest feeling of relief and progression they've got up until this point in the game. For the people who have played an unhealthy amount of this game like me, I want you to think back to the first time you beat the Eye of Cthulhu. Probably on some older version of the game, hell, maybe even before expert mode was even a thing. Because that feeling of beating your first boss in this game and opening the floodgates to the rest of the amazing fights in this game is the kind of moment that truly makes you a fan of Terraria, as you feel so much more confident and ready to tackle the entire world after you take this thing down, especially with the loot you get from this thing, being a new shield that makes mobility way more satisfying, your world's evil ore that lets you upgrade some of your gear, and some money that can help you buy some neat things or reforge your weapons to be even stronger. To conclude, the experience of fighting the Eye of Cthulhu not only highlights the appeal of Terraria's combat and how the gameplay loop is one of the most satisfying in any survival game, but also just how effective a first boss fight can be in getting the players hooked in on your game. The fight is nothing special on first glance, a very simple attack pattern that only consists of dashing in a few different ways and summoning some minions, but everything around the fight itself, the build-up and excitement to the boss that makes the defeat so much more rewarding, the items it drops and what they mean for the player's progression, and the unique feeling of fighting this thing for the first time and getting your first look at the fun and masterfully made bosses in this game, make for a first boss fight that is both decently challenging for a first time, and high energy with how fast you need to run from this thing's more aggressive attacks. A simple concept turned into one of the most iconic bosses in the game, the Eye of Cthulhu truly is more than the sum of its parts, and is the perfect introduction into this pillar of survival games. I know this video might seem like I am exaggerating how important the Eye of Cthulhu is in the wider scale of Terraria's appeal. God knows I'm good at overthinking things that interest me. But it was still so much fun taking a closer look at an enemy that I faced so many times over my hundreds of hours in this game, and I hope that you all enjoyed watching it as much as I enjoyed making it. Terraria is pretty easily my favourite game I've ever played. Hell, I've gone so far as to make mods for it. No, you can't know the names because I forgot them too. And those mods are what started my journey as a pixel artist actually, which eventually led me to making this channel. So I have a lot to be thankful for from this game, and I will never get tired of playing it, especially when I'm fighting this massive, gross eyeball. With all of that being said though, make sure to dash into that subscribe button, and as always, I'll see you when I see you. Bye!